When we hear the term self-worth, it feels heavier than self-esteem. That's because self-worth is an internal sense that you are enough and that you are deserving of love and respect. Self-esteem is the reputation you have with yourself, as we discussed last week, which has two components. One of which does have to do with competency, being able to handle yourself in the world. But the other part of it has to do with believing that you are worthy, deserving of love, self-acceptance, because self-worth says, no matter how I show up today, no matter if I'm productive, no matter if I am even taking loving actions towards myself, the belief is that I am still worthy. My therapist has a quote that it's often about the belief that we are good and we are enough, not that we are good enough, which is usually a benchmark that keeps moving that we'll never achieve. So this week, we're going to go even deeper in our series on our relationship with ourselves and ask, how do I feel about myself at the very core of my being? And if we want to improve that, how do we do so? Welcome to Immersion, 30 Minutes Beneath the Surface. I'm your host, Pamela, and here we discuss psychology and philosophy topics to find meaning in the modern world. Let's dive in. Let's start with the idea of validation. Where do we get our validation from? I've gone back and forth on this myself. I unfortunately used to get 100% of my validation from the outside. I felt okay if you felt I was okay, you being whoever I was interacting with, and it also shifted in different settings. If I was playing sports, was I performing well? If I was in class, was I getting A's? If I'm at the dance, is my dress hanging right? Does my hair look okay? And of course, a lot of this is natural. None of us want a dress that doesn't fit right, and we all want more good hair days than bad. But it's about asking, what percent of our validation from the outside is healthy, and what percent should we be getting from the inside? Peeking around in some research for this, I saw mixed results for that. But the consensus is that somewhere between 0% up to 20% of external validation of how we are thinking of ourselves is normal. And between 80 and 100% should be coming from the inside. The reason why the recommendation is not 100% purely from the inside is because it is normal to want to check and confirm how we are doing with others. For instance, if you're working on a creative project, you wouldn't want to do it in a vacuum. You'd want to make sure that you're on the right track with other people. Maybe you're about to make a decision and you're not sure if you're being too biased about something. And because we're such a social species, we naturally look around to see how we stack up compared to others, something that we will talk about later in this episode. But we do want most of that coming from the inside, rather than confirming with our boss that we're on the right track for a project and using that to validate the actual work. Often people make that about who they are, thinking, oh, I am only okay if, again, this other person thinks that I am okay. There's a big difference between getting feedback that changes how you feel about the work versus getting feedback that shakes how you feel about your very personhood to your core. Those are two completely different things. So how do we go about flipping this script and going from outside in validation to validating ourselves on the inside? We will absolutely go much deeper than this tip I'm about to give, but I did want to give something very tangible that you can start applying right away, rather than some of the deeper work we're going to be doing on shame and other stuff that takes time. The first thing you can do is start to ask how you feel about things. I'll give an example. There was someone that I had a bit of a crush on at work. And part of why I had a crush on them is because I really admired the work that they do. So yes, I was attracted to them, but I also greatly admired them. One day I was thinking, I wonder how they see me. I hope that they can see my passion for the work that I do and that I also really care about learning a lot about XYZ topic. I was seeing myself through their eyes and then trying to get validation from that imaginary thought I had, which, first of all, has no basis in reality. But more importantly, instead of asking, how do they feel about my work? I started to then ask, how do I feel about my work? And then I had a realization. I actually didn't feel that great about some of my work at the time. There was outside research that I could have been doing for my clients on specific injuries they have that I wanted to be allocating more time for. And when I started to do that, my confidence in my work grew, and I stopped thinking, oh, I hope they also admire me too, because it became about my own values of mastery and contribution. And what's funny is that person, I think, actually thought I knew more than I did. They were talking about some really niche topic, and they said, oh, you probably know more about this than me. And I was thinking, and I actually even said, no, I don't. And so that was kind of funny proof that even after I was kind of getting over this crush and working on the work, it was proof that if someone sees you in a certain way and you don't actually feel that way yourself, it never actually feels that good. And we can also shift from this outside in approach to more of an inside out approach in other smaller ways too. For instance, instead of asking, does this outfit look fashionable? Does it look okay? We can just simply ask, how do I feel about this outfit? On a date, instead of only asking, do they like me? Does this sound okay? We can ask, do I like them? How do I feel around them in their presence? One of the first times I got exposed to this idea was actually from an acting book. It was by Jack Plotnick, and it was called New Thoughts for Actors. I might link his website down below if it is still a free PDF in case you're an actor. It's really generous that he gives this book out for free. But there's a chapter called Be a Selfish Actor, and it's not how it sounds. He argues that the best thing you can do as an actor is to actually really care about play and your experience. Think about children, how completely immersed in play they are. They're not thinking, how do I look? But then someone maybe goes to acting school and they have to really care, is this scene landing okay? What does my teacher or coach think? It becomes all about how they're being perceived. But then he says when you graduate, you really need to drop that. Think of an actor that you really admire. For instance, Leonardo DiCaprio. I don't think he's thinking, oh my goodness, I hope they like me. When he is in a role, he is going for it. He is inhabiting it fully. And then, you know, what's ironic is that selfishness of just enjoying himself and being fully in a role is way more pleasurable to watch as an audience versus this kind of needy energy of needing to be liked or seen a certain way. And this applies in many areas of life. And a side benefit that as we move away from caring about how we're viewed externally to how we feel internally, we actually often end up being more magnetic, authentic, and drawing the right people into our lives. And this doesn't mean behaving selfishly in general. In fact, it can often mean the opposite. People that have a very strong internal compass and know what they care about, how they feel about things, and behave from that place often will have more integrity because they're living according to their values. Think about someone that is in a certain social dynamic. And maybe one person is a bit of an oddball and says awkward things, and they're not always invited to things, but this person is good at heart. People just kind of make fun of them behind their back. This person in the group that is confident, that has a strong sense of who they are, self-worth, knows their values, they're more likely to include that person and to be kind to them and not care as much about how it looks to other people because, again, they're not trying to get that validation from the outside. So this doesn't mean behaving selfishly. It means behaving according to what you value. And that will in turn often include compassion. So what are some sources of validation that we often get from the outside? Let's laundry list a few here. One is appearance. Another is work. This might be how hard you work, how busy you are, a certain organization you're proud to be affiliated with. Another one is academic success, both how you're doing, your level of advanced degree, the school you can say you went to. Another is material success, money, but then also house, car, jewelry, ways to display wealth. Another one is social media more broadly, getting likes. And finally, certain positions of power or leadership. All of these have exceptions. I'm not saying everyone who's in a leadership position is doing that to look a certain way. We are just talking about places that people could be getting their validation that is from the outside. And of course, there's more. Feel free to comment if you can think of others that I did not list here. But for many of these things, we often think, I will feel better about myself once I achieve XYZ, once I get there. But then, of course, we know that how we feel on the inside does not change based on these outside metrics that we were hoping would make us feel better based on how others viewed us when we were there. So as you can see, a lot of these are about comparison. For instance, the big house, the car, is not about those items themselves, but it might be about the clout or respect that people feel that they bring in comparison with others. And like we've talked about, for some of this, there's a touch of normalcy. We evolve to see how we stack up to others, but we can also evolve past this and question, there is a part of my brain that wants to compete. But is this what I really care about? This saves us from getting caught up in the wrong race to begin with, because do you really care about having the nicest house in your friend group, or does it just feel good for a moment? So much of this is unconscious too. We don't even realize we're doing it, or we don't even know what we value truly to begin with. So the answer to the question, do you really value this, might for the meantime be yes, or it might be, I don't know. It might be, I want to have a house I feel really safe in, that's beautiful, and that is something I value, but I don't care about how it stacks up to others. I think that when we really dig under things, the stacking up to others is not a priority. I think that it is hiding other things that we don't want to feel that we'll get into soon, such as shame. And so finally, on that note, I would argue that it takes time to unearth and find our values. And for anyone in competitive races like this, from jobs, looks, money, anything that's a very cold metric from the outside comparison about how you stack up with these things compared to others, I would say that there's something under that you're struggling with, whether that's shame or worth or things that we'll get into in a moment. But in the meantime, before we get deeper into flipping this script, I would like to talk about a tool you can use to see where you might be getting your validation from if you're kind of stuck here. I really like the Enneagram for this tool. Anyone that's listening that has more of a research mind that prefers that things are actually backed by papers, this is not going to be that. This is more of a spiritual approach to growth. I always like to specify which camp I'm coming from with different bullet points. But I think the Enneagram can be a great tool for growth and exploration and conversation. You might have heard of this personality test. There are 9 types, and it measures one's deepest motivations. I will list out all 9 here, and probably between 1 and 3 of them will really stick out to you. So here are the 9 types. 1, doing the right thing or doing things the right way. Their motivation is to not be imperfect or immoral. Number 2, being helpful to others. The need to be loved, to be needed and appreciated. Number 3, being the successful or admired one and thus valuable. Number 4, being unique, specifically being creative and significant in your own unique way. Number 5, being knowledgeable and competent as a route to not feel helpless or unsafe. To a 5, knowledge equals safety. Number 6, seeking security specifically tied to loyalty. They desire support from being in a group rather than alone. Number 7, chasing exploration, the desire to be happy and free as a way to escape pain. 8, the need to be strong, self-reliant, and in control of your future rather than controlled by others. And number 9, seeking peace and harmony on the inside and connection on the outside with others. So one of their deeper fears is a lack of stability because they really want that peace, that routine. And they also deeply fear separation from others, which is partially why they value harmony so much. Often, whichever type someone is gives them a helpful facade to interact with the world. For instance, the Enneagram 2 might feel as though they're able to earn love by being helpful to others. So they might feel that they generate a lot of worth or value by being helpful to others and not realizing that people love them in spite of that, not because of that. Often everyone else around us sees very clearly how we're trying to stay safe or earn love or be validated, and it's only not clear to us. And using this as a tool to see, oh, does one of these resonate? How can I use it as a tool for healing? And so I'll link something in the description in case you want to explore this as a tool for conversation and growth after this. Similar to the prior section, I'm going to weave in a few more practical tips, and then we're going to keep going deeper. This episode operates a bit like going down a staircase. We're going to have practical tips in each section, but we're also going to go a bit deeper in each section because self-worth is a bit of a deeper and heavier topic. So in all of the areas that we talked about, we can ask, instead of how am I stacking up, we can ask, am I living up to my values? For instance, instead of how did that look when I did that deadlift at the gym to the person that was watching or when I posted it on Instagram? Instead, we can ask, did I do my best? And that also helps save us from the idea that we always have to be improving or hitting new benchmarks, because sometimes your best is not a PR. It's just showing up and having the consistency to show up for what matters to you. Another thing we can do is really ask what our values are, because sometimes our values might correspond with things that might give some sort of external validation, but that is a side benefit. For instance, if a value of yours is beauty, what does that really mean to you versus what has society rewarded you for? For instance, for some people, it might mean pulling themselves together before they leave the house, but it doesn't mean everything always looks perfect. It could just be scarf and a lipstick. And it also could mean appreciating beauty in others, helping them feel beautiful, giving them a compliment. It might mean creating beautiful spaces for people to enter or appreciating beauty in a museum with art. So it's asking, what are my values and how do I live according to them? And finally, we can keep this percentage tool in the back of our mind. Like we said, between 0 and 20% from the outside might be normal. Different sources had different amounts. There is no one right answer, but I think between 0 and 10% would even be on the healthier side. We really just want that gut check from the outside. That emotional mirroring is even more important from loved ones versus the how am I doing? How am I stacking up? Which is a completely different question. One of them is cold metrics. One of them is emotional feedback. We'll get into mirroring a bit more later, but the visual that I've heard for this is the idea of a tree, and that part that's from the inside, that core part, your sense of self-worth, is the roots and the actual tree itself, and then the leaves, just this final little bit at the end that is interacting with the sunlight and the outside. That might be the part that is more connected to others, that 5 or 10%. And then that way, when something happens that is an external event that might change how someone sees themselves in another scenario, we won't be like a tree in a hurricane. We will instead be like a tree in a light breeze because we're rooted in how we feel about ourselves at our very core instead. Now, if you're the questioning type, you might be asking, wait a second, a lot of these are still conditional. They have to do with things such as, am I living up to my values? And while that's a healthier place to come from compared to just chasing whatever you think other people want you to be, at the end of the day, that's still conditional. And so let's get into that now, because unfortunately, most of us have never known a love that was not a little bit conditional in most areas of our lives. And that even applies to our relationship with ourselves. And this connects to that idea of trying to earn love that we talked about earlier. Often we will subconsciously make relationships, even with our loved ones, transactional. Someone might do something for us and then we think, oh, I need to make things level. Let me do something for them, and not just coming at it as this like purely connecting relationship. So if we've never known a love that's unconditional and not transactional, how do we start to foster that, particularly with ourselves, where it can be very difficult? So I think that now would be a good time to talk about shame and self-worth, because shame is so inherently tied to all of this. It is the opposite of self-worth. Heidi Priebe has a great video on toxic shame that I am going to link down below. I will talk about a few takeaways from it here, but I would highly recommend checking out her video and her channel in general. She is, I mean, I don't know her, but she seems like such a phenomenal, grounded, compassionate person, and she talks a lot about these kinds of topics. But the episode that I'm going to be linking in particular, where she talks about toxic shame, she is pulling from the work of John Bradshaw. And she describes that healthy shame is something we experience when we do something where we've overstepped or behaved out of integrity. Whereas toxic shame is different. It's the feeling that we don't have any integrity to begin with, or that something is wrong with us in our absolute core. And I'm quoting her now. She said, When someone with healthy self-esteem makes a mistake or goes past their limits, they feel healthy and appropriate shame. When someone is, as John Bradshaw would call it, shame-bound in their identity, someone who is bound by toxic shame, when they make a mistake or go past their own or someone else's limits, becomes overwhelmed with the feeling that I am a mistake, I am worthless, disgusting, whatever it is you internalized about yourself at a very young age that became the core of your identity. I think, unfortunately, many people that have shame don't know that they're shame-bound. So let's talk about some signs that someone actually has a lot of shame and might be suppressing it or not know it. One is having addictions. Often we use these to escape the feelings of shame. This isn't just things such as drugs or alcohol. It could also be food or love addiction, such as fantasizing a ton about a specific person. Also, perfectionism, or being your own harshest critic, thinking that as long as I do everything perfectly, I am above reproach from the outside. That is because we feel shame and we are scared of any negative feedback. So then we are extra hard on ourselves instead. There might be some unexplained physical symptoms because we're carrying so much stress in our body. We also want to make sure not to blame people and say, oh, you're having physical symptoms because you haven't healed X, Y, or Z. But it could be part of a cluster of signs to keep in mind. Another one is difficulty in relationships, volatile emotions, fear of forming close relationships, fear of being seen as you truly are, and turning to people-pleasing, withdrawing, and believing that you know that you cannot be your full self, so you have to be this other version around other people. You can't behave authentically. And lots of comparison to others, like we talked about earlier. And if this sounds like you, again, I highly recommend checking out her video like we talked about. But one tip that she gave within the episode that I think is really beautiful is one step is not necessarily getting to this sense of extreme worthiness or self-love. It is just getting to neutral. It is getting to the idea that we are no better or no worse than any other human being, and that actually we're just like everyone else. She mentions in the episode that often when people struggle with shame, they will come up with either an overinflated view of the self, that grandiosity, or they will have a story that they're not good enough and then live a life that reinforces that. For instance, someone that becomes an overachiever or someone that gravitates to a life of crime. I often see personally, though, even within the same person, this fluctuating between the overinflated view of self or thinking that they're absolutely nothing and worthless. So while she mentions that people will often gravitate towards one path, I will often see within the same person these ranging and swinging highs and lows, instead of an appropriate view of the self as a normal human who has value, but also things that they struggle with, and holding these in our mind at the same time. So as we talked about earlier, with the list of different ways we might get validation, with the Enneagram, we all develop a mask that we use to interact with our world. And we need to ask, why have I chosen this specific mask? For some people, it's being viewed as smart enough. For some people, it's being really funny in the class clown. And we develop an identity around, I am good enough because of XYZ. And we develop that mask further and further. And so we need to ask, why have I chosen this specific mask? What from my childhood made this mask fit just right? How was it reinforced by people around me? And this gets into a bit of what people might unpack in therapy, but we can also unpack it with journaling. Now, of course, because we are talking about deeper topics like self-worth and shame, I will say my usual plug that I highly recommend working with a therapist. My goodness, especially on this topic. But if you cannot work with one, I really love a tip from Heidi's video that you also could consider groups. For instance, 12-step groups, even if you're not religious. And I will link an article down below on some thoughts about joining one of those groups, even if you're not religious. But in support groups with others, we also can get that safe space to share things and to work towards healing. Because often with these topics, it can get a bit worse before it gets better. When we have something like shame, we often tuck it away in this little box in a closet in the back of our mind. And what we're talking about here is taking that box off of that shelf that's up high in that closet and opening it up and looking inside. And so it can get painful and it can kick up things that you were able to keep tucked away. And so that's why support is really important. Which brings us now to the idea of looking to certain resources. You might have heard of the work of Brené Brown. I'm smiling just talking about her and thinking of her because her work is so powerful, because it is about the idea of vulnerability being an antidote to shame. Shame grows in the dark, and when we connect with others authentically and share vulnerably and show up as our true selves, we work to move past it. Do start moving towards healing. There is a great book that she wrote called The Gifts of Imperfection. She has many good books out, but this book is on this topic in general. I will link that down below as well. I read that early in my healing journey and saved many quotes from it, so I would highly recommend that. Here is a quote from her now. Authenticity is a collection of choices that we have to make every day. It's about the choice to show up and be real, the choice to be honest, the choice to let our true selves be seen. I love this quote because it reminds us that so much of what we're talking about here is not a one and done situation of, oh yeah, I worked on my self-worth. It's about how we show up constantly. But it does get easier over time. As you share one little thing that's a bit more real with a loved one, it becomes a bit easier to connect with them. Now, granted, a lot of this is about having safe relationships to do that in the first place. If the other person has not worked on any of this within themselves, this could kick up a lot in them if you behave authentically and they are not ready to take off their mask and behave authentically. So it's also about noticing where is a safe place to show up. And it doesn't mean that the people that we interact with have to be completely healed, but they should feel open and safe, and maybe they're working on themselves as well. So how might this show up as little small choices in our day-to-day? I will give you two examples. Both have to do with dating. One is maybe you're on a date and you know that you often change a little bit to be what the other person wants. And maybe you just behave 10% more authentically than you normally would. You don't agree with that thing that you don't completely agree with. And it's one little moment, but it does change how you feel, not only in your emotions and your body, but also, like we've talked about in this series, how you feel about yourself, because this is an upward spiral. Then you start to realize, oh, that was a moment of integrity. I feel good about that. And that wasn't that hard. And I'm safe after. It's okay. Maybe you grew up in a place where it wasn't safe to disagree. And then you slowly learn that it is safe. And you also learn trust in yourself to be more authentic in the future. And another is a really small example of being authentic and it helping to reduce uncomfortability in a certain situation. So I was going over to an ex's for Christmas to meet his family. This was the first time he'd ever brought someone home. It was also a major holiday. It was the first time I was ever meeting a partner's family in a very adult relationship in New York. And I walked in the door, set down some flowers or something that I brought. I was in an outfit trying to make a good impression and probably holding my body pretty stiff. And his mom walked over and gave me a hug. And then she kind of took a deep exhale and said, "Are you nervous?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And then she said, "Good, me too." And then we both laughed and it was more open after that. Of course, I think there was still some nerves, but the idea of calling something out, the idea of being authentic instead of keeping up this facade led to deeper connection. And that's just a tiny example of that in a practical way. And so finally, to close this episode, one trap that people often fall into is intellectualizing all of this. To feel as though we've learned these lessons, but really we've learned them as facts rather than emotionally or in our bones. There are two signs that this could be happening. One is if all of your experience is purely through reading about this in books or talking about it as a fact, but you haven't actually felt any of the discomfort or pain that may have led to some of these self-worth issues. Another is if you can talk about this, but you don't actually feel that your life is improving in any way. Relationships might still be tough. You might still be getting that validation from the outside. And maybe you feel okay about it because you at least know you're doing it, but your life hasn't actually been improving. You still feel this need to show up perfectly in so many areas and to get that approval from the outside. We're going to go deeper in the next episode on the idea of contingent self-worth and keep going into this topic. I'm really excited to speak to you about it. If you find this helpful and if you want to work through this topic with a friend, please share it with them. And looking forward to speaking to you next week.